Hi, this is going to be a two-part series on Lambda. So the first part is going to be a general introduction and the second part would be a live demonstration on how Lambda works. So Lambda is a part of the compute service that is provided by AWS. So the compute also provides services like EC2, Elastic Beanstalk, Lightsail, Batch, etc. So what exactly is Lambda? So at a very high level, it lets you run code without having the need to manage any servers underneath. You have the option of running the following runtimes: Node, Python, Ruby, Java, Go, and .NET. You can also run custom runtimes, so it's not just limited to these following runtimes, but these are the ones that are currently available. The drawback of using a Lambda function is that you can't run it for more than 15 minutes and it times out if your process or if your function runs for more than 15 minutes. It also has a limitation that the memory cannot be more than 10 GB. So if you have a process which has a lot of memory requirement, then it's not advisable to use Lambda. The features of Lambdas include continuous scaling. So what that means is on one day you could have your Lambdas running a few times, and on the other day you could have it running 100 or 1,000 times. So you don't have to worry about maintaining the backend infrastructure as you would if you were running an EC2 where you have to manage the auto scaling and the load balancing, etc. So all that is actually taken care of by AWS itself. It is cost optimized with millisecond metering. So what that means is that you are just the cost involved in the Lambda is just for the time that particular code ran. So if your Lambda is not being invoked, you are not charged for that at all. So that makes it very cost effective if your functions run just for a small amount of time and you don't have to maintain a EC2 machine throughout the day and pay for that when it's basically idle for most of the time. So Lambdas can be triggered in the following ways. You can trigger it via the console. You have the Lambda APIs. There is also the AWS Standard Development Kit and there is the AWS CLI. There are two ways in which Lambdas execute. The first way is the synchronous invocation of Lambda. So what that means is that every time a client invokes a Lambda function, it waits till the Lambda function processes and the output of the Lambda function is returned back to the client. So let's say a Lambda function ran for 10 seconds. So the client will wait for 10 seconds for that particular Lambda function to execute. And then the Lambda will give back the result of that function back to the client. So if you were to run a Lambda function synchronously, then this is how you would invoke it. You just need to give the name of the function, the payload, and you can give a response.json. So once the function has been invoked, the response.json file will have the output for that particular Lambda function. The second way of invoking a Lambda is asynchronously. So in this, the client sends a request to the event queue and it gets back a response instantaneously. So the client does not wait for the Lambda function to execute. So in this, to invoke a asynchronous function via an AWS CLI, this is how you would do it. You just need to give the function name and you have to give an extra parameter called the invocation type, and you have to mention the value for invocation type as event. The rest remains the same. The response.json file will generally not contain any information apart from the fact that the Lambda has executed, because the response is given back instantaneously after the Lambda function has been invoked. So generally AWS works best when it is combined with other AWS services. The most commonly used pattern is when you would link a API gateway with a Lambda function. So how that works is a user will send a HTTP request to an API gateway, and the API gateway will synchronously trigger the Lambda, and once the Lambda executes, it will give back the result of that Lambda function back to the API gateway, and there from the API gateway it goes back to the user. So this is a form of synchronous invocation of Lambda. Similarly, you could also use Kinesis streams to invoke Lambda function. This works a little differently. In this, the Lambda function polls for the Kinesis stream, and this too is executed synchronously. An example of asynchronous execution would be an SNS topic. So an SNS sends a topic to a Lambda function, and it does not wait for the Lambda to complete its execution. So an SNS is an asynchronous form of execution with Lambda, has an asynchronous form of execution with Lambda, and so does an S3 bucket and an RDS database. You could have an S3 bucket trigger a Lambda if in case the S3 bucket has an update, or even if an RDS Aurora table has an update. And in that case, there would be an asynchronous trigger to a Lambda function. The Lambda can also act as an input to certain destinations like a Aurora stream, another Lambda function, or even an SNS or an SQS. And this pattern can keep going on. So this was a very basic demonstration on the capabilities of Lambda. In my next demonstration, I will show you how these things work practically. Thank you for now, and I hope to see you in the next lecture.